Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and remember that Context is Everything Media Network founder and CEO, John Michael, is reading a textbook. Cover to cover. Now, stick around, please, because I'm going to be reading this textbook, but first, and very excitingly, I'm going to be reading a review of yesterday's reading. And now, when you think about it, the name is Context is Everything Media Network. This is establishing context. I'm reading yesterday's review. Let's do that now. And then we'll go into Turbulent Centuries in Africa, which is Chapter 16, Section 4, for today. But yesterday, let's start there. And here we go. Thank you for being here. 16.3. New France, New England, and New Netherlands? Building New France. In the 1500s, French fishing ships harvested cod off Newfoundland, Canada. Samuel de Champlain built the first permanent French settlement in Quebec in 1608. Jesuits followed, hoping to convert Native Americans, Jesuits being Catholic missionaries. With Native American allies, French fur traders claimed vast territory from Quebec to Louisiana and the Gulf of Mexico. That's a lot of land. The population of New France, which was the name of Canada apparently, grew slowly as harsh climate attracted few French peasants. Louis XIV sent officials, soldiers, and settlers to strengthen royal powers and boost revenues. However, the population remained small compared to the 13 English colonies. English established their first permanent colony in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. But it was not until tobacco became a cash crop that the colony thrived. Now listen close. The Pilgrims, a Protestant sect, arrived in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620, seeking religious freedom. Not going to be able to practice that sort of belief in England. No, sir. They got the Church of England. They signed the Mayflower Compact, which laid out guidelines for governing the colony, an important early step towards self-government. In the 1600s and 1700s, the English established 13 colonies with varying ways of life. Africans were brought to the colonies and sold as slaves. The English monarchs asserted control over the colonies, but English colonists enjoyed a large degree of self-government, which grew out of the English experience with representative assemblies, starting with the Magna Carta and the recent contemporary development of the parliament system, competing for power. In the 1600s, Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands were competing for colonies and trade around the world. They fought over territories in North America, including Dutch colony of New Netherland. Never heard of it until yesterday. Which the English seized in 1664 and named it New York. The English settlers in Georgia also clashed with the Spanish in nearby Florida. The British and French emerged as bitter rivals for power around the globe in the 1700s. They clashed in Europe, North America, Africa, and Asia, with the French and Indian War in North America raging at its center point from 1754 to 1763. The British eventually won control of Canada and dominated North America after 1763 Treaty of Paris. And finally, the impact on Native Americans. Not going to be good. The arrival of European settlers in North America had a profound impact on Native Americans, as in Spanish America. Some formed alliances, but clashes frequently erupted as settlers claimed more land. Disease weakened or killed many, and the Native American population plummeted. However, Indian technologies, food, and medical knowledge helped shape the emerging new culture of North America, trailblazed trails blazed by Indians became highways for settlers moving west, and many geographic features bear Indian names. Today, many people are taking a new look at the Indian religions and their tradition for natural conservation. On to today's reading. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe and leave a coin in the comments. If you're the first person to leave a coin in the comments, because I've been asking for like a week, I'll give it a heart. And I will not give anyone else a heart. I'll only give them thumbs up henceforth. So if you're the first, you get a heart. Anyone else going to get a thumbs up. First to the party. Here we go. Section 4 of Chapter 16. Folks, we're about to cross the 400-page mark here. A lot of reading done, and some yet to go. So subscribe, join along, and let's hit the 400 milestone together. So listen all the way through. Turbulent centuries in Africa. Setting the scene. The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast of the seas was a slave ship, which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon converted into terror when I was carried on board. So wrote Aluda Aquino. In the 1750s, when he was 11 years old, Aquino was seized from his Nigerian village by slave traders. He was then transported as human cargo from the West Africa to the Americas. Enslaved Africans like Equiano formed part of the international trade network that arose during the First Global Age. First Global Age meaning Europe and Asia interacting in deep depth, and that interaction yielded the discovery of the Americas, because they were like, well, we got to find faster route to Asia. So when they say global age, that's what they mean. Encounters between Europeans and Africans had been taking place since the 1400s. By then, as you have read, Africa was home to diverse societies, and Islam had become an important force in some parts of the continent. As Europeans arrived, they would bring their own influences to Africa. European outposts in Africa is the first heading of this section. European outposts in Africa. And stick around, we're almost at 400 pages. I might have a surprise. I might. In the 1400s, Portuguese ships explored the coast of West Africa, looking for a sea route to India. They built small forts along the West African coast to trade for gold, collect food and water, and repair their ships. The Portuguese lacked the power to push into African interior. They did, however, attack the coastal cities of East Africa, such as Mombasa and Malindi, which were hubs of international trade. With cannons blazing, they expelled Arabs who controlled the East African trade network and took over the thriving commerce for themselves, those Portuguese. The Portuguese, however, gained little profit from their victories. Trade between the interior and the coast soon dwindled. By the 1600s, the once prosperous East African coastal cities had sunk into poverty. Other Europeans soon followed the Portuguese into Africa. The Dutch, the English, and the French established forts along the western coast of Africa. Like the Portuguese, they exchanged muskets, tools, and cloth for gold, ivory, hides, and slaves. New heading: the Atlantic slave trade. In the 1500s, Europeans began to view slaves as the most important item of African trade. What terminology. Wow. Important item. That's what they said. Not my words. I'm reading a book from 2001. Slavery had existed in Africa as elsewhere around the world since ancient times. Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Persians, Indians, and Aztecs often enslaved defeated foes. Our word slave comes from the large number of Slavs taken from southern Russia to work as unpaid laborers in Roman times? I didn't know that at all. That's new information. Got to make sure that that is in the notes for this section, along with other things, but that's like a word thing that I didn't realize. It's pretty interesting. The Arab Empire also used slave labor, often captives taken from Africa. In the Middle East, many enslaved Africans worked on farming estates or large-scale irrigation projects. Others became artisans, soldiers, and merchants. Some rose to prominence in the Muslim world, even though they were officially slaves. Europeans and African slave traders under the Atlantic slave trade. European and African slave traders. The Atlantic slave trade began in the 1500s to fill the need for labor in Spain's American empire. In the next 300 years, it grew into a huge and profitable business. Each year, traders shipped tens of thousands of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to work on tobacco and sugar plantations in the Americas. Europeans seldom went into the interior to take part in slave raids. Instead, they relied on African rulers and traders to seize captives in the interior and bring them to the coastal trading posts and fortresses. There, the captives were exchanged for textiles, metalwork, rum, tobacco, weapons, and gunpowder. The slave trade intensified as the demand for slaves increased in the Americas. And as the demand for luxury goods increased in Africa, well, triangular trade under the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade formed one part of three-legged trade network known as the triangular trade. On the first leg, merchant ships brought goods from Africa to be traded for slaves. On the second leg, known as the Middle Passage, the slaves were transported to the West Indies, where the enslaved Africans were exchanged for sugar, molasses, and other products. In the final leg, these products were shipped to Europe, or European colonies in the Americas. The prosperity of port cities such as Nantes in France, Bristol in England, and Salem in Massachusetts thus depended in large part on the slave trade. Horrors of the Middle Passage under the Atlantic slave trade. For enslaved Africans, the Middle Passage was a horror. Once purchased, Africans were packed below decks in slave ships. Hundreds of men and women and children were crammed into single vessels. Slave ships became floating coffins on which up to half of the Africans on board died from disease or brutal mistreatment. Some enslaved Africans resisted. A few tried to seize control of the ships and return to Africa. Others committed suicide by leaping overboard. One African recalls such an incident during the Middle Passage. One day, two of my wearied countrymen, who were chained together, jumped into the sea. Immediately another followed their example. Two of the wretches were drowned, but the ship's crew got the other, and afterwards flogged him unmercifully for thus attempting to prefer death to slavery. Oladoa Aquino. A quotation from that gentleman from the book The Life of Gustavus Vasa. I don't know who that is. African leaders resist. This is a subheading still under the Atlantic slave trade. Some African leaders tried to slow down the transatlantic slave trade or even stop it altogether. They used different forms of resistance, but in the end, the system that supported the trade was simply too strong for them. An early voice raised against the slave trade was that of Afonso I, ruler of Congo in West Central Africa. As a young man, Afonso, Affonso, was tortured by Portuguese missionaries. After becoming king in 1505, he called the Portuguese to help him develop the Congo as a modern Christian state. We made it to page 400. Before long, however, Afonso grew alarmed. Each year, more and more Portuguese came to Congo to buy slaves. They offered high prices, and government officials and local chiefs eagerly entered the trade. Even Christian missionaries began to buy and sell Africans. Afonso insisted, "It is our will that in these kingdoms there should not be any trade of slaves, nor outlet for them." Congo, he stated, could benefit from contacts with Europe, but the trade of human lives was evil. His appeal failed, and the slave trade continued. In the late 1700s, another African ruler, the Almami of Futa Toro in northern Senegal, tried to halt the slave trade in his lands. Since the 1500s, French sea captains had brought slaves from African traders to Futa Toro, Futatoro. The Almami decided to put a stop to this practice. I don't know what Almami is, but I'll spell it for you. Almamy. In 1788, he forbade any one of the transport slaves through Futa Toro for sale abroad. The sea captains and local chiefs protested and called on the Almami to repel or cancel the law. I'm not sure what the Almami is still. It is lowercase a, not a proper noun. The Almami refused. He returned the presents to the captain who had sent him in hopes of winning him over for their cause. "All the riches in the world would not make me change my mind," he said. Who's he? Futatoro? That's the name of a place. Almami is not a proper noun, and they've not mentioned it once in this book before. Strange. I might have missed something. Please leave in a comment below what I missed. The Almami's victory was short-lived, however. The inland slave traders simply worked out a new route to the coasts. Sailing to his new market, the French captains easily purchased the slaves that the Almami had prevented from buying in Senegal. There was nothing the Almami could do to stop them. Impact of the Atlantic slave trade. Historians are still debating the number of Africans who were affected by the Atlantic slave trade. In the 1500s, it is estimated that 2,000 enslaved Africans were sent to the Americas each year. In the 1780s, when the slave trade was at its peak, that number topped to 80,000 a year. In the mid-1800s, when the overseas slave trade was finally stopped, an estimated 11 million enslaved Africans had reached the Americas. Another 2 million probably died under brutal conditions in the voyage between Africa and America. The slave trade caused a decline of some African states and the rise of others. In West Africa, the loss of countless numbers of young women and men resulted in some small states disappearing forever. At the same time, there arose new African states whose way of life depended on the slave trade. The rulers of these powerful new states waged war against other Africans so they could gain control of the slave trade in their region and reap the profits. New heading: Rise of new African states. Among the largest states that arose in West Africa in the 16 and 1700s were the Oyo, O-Y-O, Bornu, and Dahomey. Another state, the Asante Kingdom, emerged in the area occupied by modern Ghana. The Asante Kingdom, subheading under Rise of New African States. The Asante Kingdom. In the late 1600s, an able military leader, Osei Tutu, won control of the trading city of Kumasi. From there, he conquered neighboring peoples and organized the Asante Kingdom. Osei Tutu claimed that his right to rule came from heaven. Leading chiefs served as a council of advisors, but were subject to the royal will. Officials chosen by merit rather than by birth supervised an efficient bureaucracy. They managed the royal monopolies over gold mining and the slave trade. A monopoly is an exclusive control of a business or industry. The Asante traded with Europeans on the coast, exchanging gold and slaves for firearms, but they shrewdly paid off rival Europeans against one another to protect their own interests. Islamic Crusades. In the 1700s, the early 1800s, an Islamic revival spread across West Africa. It began among the Fulani people in northern Nigeria. The scholar and preacher Usman Dan Fodio denounced the corruption of local Hausa rulers. He called for social and religious reforms based on the Sharia, or Islamic law. In the early 1800s, Usman inspired Fulani herders and Hausa townspeople to rise up against their rulers. Usman and his successors set up powerful Islamic states. Under their rule, literacy increased, local wars quieted, and trade improved. Their successes inspired other Muslim reform movements in West Africa. Between about 1780 and 1880, more than a dozen Islamic leaders rose to power, replacing old rulers or founding new states in the Western Sudan. Let me say that again. Between about 1780 and 1880, more than a dozen Islamic leaders rose to power, replacing old rulers or founding new states in the Western Sudan. Battles for power in southern Africa. New heading. Over many centuries, Bantu-speaking peoples had migrated into southern Africa. In the 1652, Dutch immigrants also arrived in the region. They built Cape Town to supply ships sailing to and from East Indies. Dutch farmers called Boers, B-O-E-R-S, settled in around Cape Town. Over time, they ousted or enslaved the Khoisan herders who had lived there. The Boers held to a Calvinist belief that they were the elect or chosen of God. They looked on Africans as inferiors. In the 1700s, Boer herders and ivory hunters began to push north from Cape Colony. As they did, they had to battle several powerful African groups. Now, just to elucidate some terminology that's being used in this textbook, East Indies, they mean India. West Indies, they mean the Americas. Shaka and the Zulus. The Zulus had migrated into southern Africa in the 1500s. In the early 1800s, there emerged a new force under a ruthless and brilliant leader, Shaka. He built on the success of earlier leaders who had begun to organize young fighters into permanent regiments. In 1818 and 1826, or rather in 1818 and 1828, Shaka waged relentless war and conquered many nearby peoples. He absorbed their young men and women into Zulu regiments. By encouraging rival groups to forget their differences, he cemented a growing pride in the Zulu kingdom. Shaka's wars disrupted life across southern Africa. Groups driven from their homelands by the Zulus adopted Shaka's tactics. They then migrated north, conquering still other people and creating their own powerful state. Later, Shaka's half-brother took over the Zulu kingdom. About this time, the Zulus faced a new threat: the arrival of a well-armed, mounted Boers migrating north from the Cape Colony. And this is the last section for the day. I appreciate you all listening. If you've made it this far, please consider subscribing. Please consider thumbs upping. And please consider leaving a coin in the comments. If you are the first person to leave a coin, I will give it a heart. Any subsequent coins, I will give a thumbs up. But the first coin will get a heart, and that will be the only person who gets a heart from a coin comment henceforth. Boers versus Zulus. In about 1815, the Cape Colony passed from the Dutch to the British. Many Boers resented British laws that abolished slavery and otherwise interfered in their way of life. To escape British rule, they loaded their goods into covered wagons and started north. In the late 1830s, several thousand Boer families joined the Great Trek. As the migrating Boers came into contact with Zulus, fighting quickly broke out. At first, Zulu regiments held their own, but in the end, Zulu spears could not defeat Boer guns. The struggle for control in the land would rage until the end of the century, as you will read later. And on that note, I wish you all a wonderful day, evening, or whatever else an option is, but I hope you have a good one. God bless. Bye-bye. Please like and subscribe and comment. That'd be really great.